Before the battlefields, before the flags and uniforms, there was a nation divided by a question it had postponed for generations. Could a republic built on the language of liberty continue to hold millions of people in bondage? Between 1861 and 1865, the United States entered its Civil War. On one side stood the Union, the United States government led by President Abraham Lincoln. On the other stood the Confederacy, 11 southern states that had seceded and formed their own government. The conflict would begin as a struggle over the survival of the Union. But as the years passed, it became something larger, a war whose outcome would determine whether slavery could survive in the United States. The division was not simply a quarrel between two regions. It was a conflict over political power, economic systems, and human freedom. Enslaved people were treated as property under law, forced to work, separated from families, and denied the rights that the nation claimed to value. Many white Americans opposed slavery for different reasons. Some believed it threatened free labor. Others argued that it violated the ideals of the Declaration of Independence. Enslaved people themselves resisted every day by preserving families and communities, slowing work, escaping when possible, learning in secret, and claiming their own freedom whenever the war opened a path. The story of emancipation was never only handed down from above. It was also pressed upward by the courage and determination of the people who had been enslaved. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories, and Southern leaders feared that their political power and social order were threatened. Beginning with South Carolina, states seceded from the Union. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The attack marked the opening of the war. The two sides were often described through their colors. Union soldiers wore blue. Confederate soldiers were associated with gray. But behind those uniforms were millions of civilians, families, workers, politicians, and soldiers living through a crisis that would reshape the continent. The Union fought to preserve the United States. The Confederacy fought for independence, and its leaders openly defended a society founded on slavery. At first, the Lincoln administration spoke primarily about saving the Union. Yet the war itself began to change the meaning of that mission. As Union armies moved into the South, enslaved people escaped from plantations and sought protection behind federal lines. Union commanders faced a question they could not avoid. Should the army return these people to those who claimed to own them, or recognize that their labor was helping the Confederate war effort? Many commanders began calling the fugitives contraband of war. The term was important because it still reflected the language of property, but the policy created a practical opening. Thousands of enslaved people in camps, and their presence made emancipation more ability more doubtful. Freedom was not limited at the end of the war. People were being taunted during the war.
In September 1862, Union and Confederate armies met at Antietam in Maryland. It was one of the bloodiest single days in American history. The battle did not destroy the Confederacy, but it gave Lincoln the opportunity he had been waiting for. 5 days later, he announced a preliminary emancipation measure. It warned the states still in rebellion that unless they returned to the Union, the enslaved people within those states would be declared free. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. It declared that people held as slaves in the rebellious states are, and henceforward shall be, free. It was a turning point. But it was not a simple magic moment. The words needed armies, communities, and determined people to make them real. The proclamation had important limits. It applied to areas in rebellion, not to every place where slavery still existed. It did not immediately free enslaved people in the loyal border states, and it excluded Confederate territories already controlled by the Union. Its freedom depended upon Union victory. Yet those limits do not diminish its importance. The proclamation transformed the purpose of the war and announced that the federal government would now strike directly at slavery in the Confederate States. It also authorized black men to serve in the Union Army and Navy. That decision recognized a truth that had been visible from the beginning. The people fighting for their freedom would also help win it. The war for the Union was becoming a war for freedom. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers and sailors served the Union by the end of the war. They faced discrimination in pay, equipment, assignments, and promotion. Some were commanded by officers who did not believe they belonged in uniform. Still, they enlisted, drilled, marched, fought, guarded prisoners, built roads, carried supplies, and held their ground. Their service challenged the belief that African Americans were not citizens capable of defending a nation. For many, military service was more than a uniform. It was a declaration of personhood. It was a demand that the country recognize the humanity it had denied. When black troops entered a town, enslaved people often understood what their presence meant. The blue uniform could be a sign that the old order was beginning to break. Emancipation did not move in a straight line. It arrived unevenly, often in fragments. A family might hear that the Union Army was nearby. A laborer might leave a plantation at night. A mother might try to keep her children together while crossing dangerous roads toward federal lines. Some enslaved people negotiated, resisted, withheld labor, or simply walked away. Their decisions weakened the Confederate economy and deprived Confederate armies of the labor on which they depended. The proclamation gave national force to a freedom struggle already underway. It did not create the desire for freedom. That desire had survived in families, churches, songs, stories, and acts of resistance long before Lincoln signed the document. The people most affected by emancipation were also among its most important makers.
Behind every army were communities under pressure. Women managed farms and businesses, cared for children, endured shortages, and searched for missing relatives. Enslaved families faced the constant threat of sale, violence, and separation. In the North, public opinion shifted as the war grew longer and more costly. Some supported emancipation as a moral necessity. Others accepted it as a military measure. Still others opposed equality and resisted the enlistment of black troops. The United States was not transformed into a just society overnight. The end of slavery would require more than a proclamation and more than a military victory. It would require a struggle over citizenship, voting rights, education, land, labor, and memory. The battlefield was only one place where the future was being decided. The Civil War brought destruction on a scale the United States had never experienced. Soldiers died from battle wounds and disease. Civilians lost homes, crops, animals, and family members. Towns and rail lines were damaged, and the South's economy was devastated. The human cost cannot be reduced to numbers. Every casualty was a person with a name, a voice, and people who remembered them. The slow blues carries a useful reminder here.
It does not rush past sorrow. It allows a note to bend, linger, and speak quietly. In the same way, the history of emancipation should not be told as a clean victory without fear, grief, conflict, and unfinished work. Freedom came through struggle, and its arrival carried both joy and profound loss. By 1864, Union military pressure was growing across the South. The Union controlled the Mississippi River, dividing the Confederacy. In the East, fighting continued around Virginia, Washington, and Richmond. Union victory depended on soldiers and sailors, but also on industry, transportation, food, finance, and the ability to sustain a long war. The Confederacy had capable commanders and determined troops, yet it faced growing shortages and the loss of territory. Every advance by federal troops could expand the area in which the proclamation was enforced. In that sense, military movement and emancipation became connected. The map of Union control was also becoming a map of liberation. But liberation still required protection. Without the army, promises could be ignored or violently reversed.
Abraham Lincoln increasingly described the conflict as a test of democratic government. In the Gettysburg Address, he spoke of a new birth of freedom and a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Those words did not erase the nation's contradictions. They exposed them. A government claiming to represent the people could not permanently exclude millions from personhood and liberty. Lincoln's own views developed during the war, as did national policy. The pressure of events, the actions of enslaved people, military necessity, abolitionist demands, and the service of black troops all pushed the country toward a more revolutionary understanding of the conflict. History is sometimes changed by a single document. More often, a document becomes powerful because people are already moving around it. In 1865, Confederate resistance began to collapse. Union forces captured Richmond, the Confederate capital. General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in April. The surrender did not instantly heal the nation, and it did not end every act of violence. But it marked the military defeat of the Confederacy and the survival of the United States. That same year, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the nation. This was the constitutional step that completed what wartime policy had begun. Freedom was no longer limited to areas in rebellion. It became a national legal principle, at least in law. The long struggle to make that principle real would continue for generations. News of emancipation did not arrive everywhere at the same time. In Galveston, Texas, Union General Gordon Granger announced the end of slavery on June 19, 1865. The date became known as Juneteenth, a celebration of freedom and a reminder of how delayed justice can be. Even after slavery was abolished, white supremacist violence, unequal laws, economic exploitation, and political exclusion denied many African Americans the full promise of freedom. So emancipation should not be remembered as a single day when every barrier disappeared. It was a beginning, a legal rupture, a military transformation, and a continuing demand for equal citizenship. The question was no longer whether slavery would survive. The question became whether freedom would be protected. The Civil War is remembered through monuments,
documents, family stories, songs, battlefields, and graves. Memory can honor courage, but it can also hide responsibility. To remember the conflict honestly is to name the central fact. Slavery was fundamental to the crisis that produced secession and war. It is also to remember the people who resisted slavery, escaped it, fought against it, and rebuilt their lives after emancipation. The blue and gray uniforms are part of the image of the war, but they are not the whole story. The deeper story is about choices, whether to defend an unjust system, whether to resist it, and whether a nation can change when its founding ideals are measured against human lives. History asks us not only what happened, but what we choose to remember. The American Civil War ended in 1865 with Union victory and the abolition of slavery. But the meaning of freedom was still being written by the people who had survived bondage and demanded a place in the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation changed the direction of the war. Black soldiers and sailors helped secure the victory. Enslaved people themselves turned flight, resistance, labor, and courage into forces the old order could not contain. As this guitar carries its final phrases, the history remains with us. A nation divided by slavery fought to preserve itself, and in doing so was forced to confront what liberty must mean. The final lesson is not that freedom was simply given. It is that freedom was claimed, defended, expanded, and still requires care. The music fades, the responsibility does not.
Effects on the computer now. Now it's gone with the wind, man. Have a good time, man.